Good morning and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for this event, We Charge Imperialism, US Sanctions Against the Global Majority. This event is sponsored by the Committee of Anti-Imperialists in solidarity with Iran. And you may well have attended one of our previous events or learned more about the tribunal that's coming forward, but this particular event is preparing us to launch the International People's Tribunal on US imperialism, sanctions, blockades, and coercive economic measures. The tribunal is going to be a powerful international legal effort and a political effort from people and countries around the world to fight back against US unilateral coercive measures and against economic coercive measures overall that are taken in the interest of imperialism and imperial domination. We are taking action to challenge US atrocities, and to that end, we will be organizing a series of hearings that will provide deep and detailed information about how sanctions, blockades, and coercive economic measures affect the countries of 16 nations around the world. That's economically, politically, socially, in terms of development, environment, in terms of the experience of women, in terms of the experience of people who are struggling to live and survive in a world that is dominated by the monster of US imperialism. We will be speaking from Zimbabwe to Palestine, from Lebanon to Syria, to Haiti and Cuba, that the peoples of the world must come together and that those of us who are engaged in the law and legal professions and advocacy have a responsibility to take action to put an end to this regime of sanctions that is threatening the world and that is one of the key weapons used by imperialism in its war against the people of the world. The purpose of this tribunal aims to build an international consensus around the illegality of sanctions and against US imperialism, and to build an international anti-imperialist movement with the US as its focus that serves to block and build a real people's movement, as well as take meaningful legal action to hold the US accountable for its sanctions and stop these imperialist war crimes from continuing to take place on a daily basis. The tribunal will take place through a series of hearings between January and July of 2023. We'll begin with an in-person event in New York in January, and we'll proceed through virtual hearings that will focus on the situation of each country being addressed by the tribunal. These hearings will take place virtually, and they will be accessible to people around the world. And we want you to register for these hearings. We'll be sharing the information with you about these hearings so that you can listen to and absorb this testimony and information and use it in a tool in your own writing, research, advocacy, and organizing to expose the crimes of US imperialism and block US sanctions. In order to make this tribunal a success, however, we need to be able to fund and support this work that is going on. We need to be able to bring international jurors to participate in these events. We need to make it possible for expert witnesses to present their testimony. This is going to be a very comprehensive effort with much more work to continue. And so today we're asking you that if you can contribute to helping make this tribunal a success, please make a financial contribution today to our fundraiser to support the International People's Tribunal on US imperialism, blockade, sanctions, and coercive economic measures. Your contribution will help to make sure that this tribunal is truly able to fulfill its potential to form a powerful legal and political base to confront and challenge US imperialism overall and the specific weapon that it is using for colonial domination, economic exploitation, as well as hybrid warfare, which are blockade, sanctions, and coercive economic measures. We're very honored to have an outstanding panel of speakers with us today who will, through the next hour, provide us with analysis, insight, education, and calls to action as we charge imperialism and hold the US accountable for its crimes against humanity. We'll be hearing today from Corinna Mullin, from Bikrum Gill, from David Paul, from Eunha Jeong, and I will introduce each speaker as they prepare to speak on the program today. So we'll be hearing first from Dr. Corinna Mullin, who is a professor in global politics and political economy at the City University of New York, and she is also a member of the steering committee of the Tribunal. She, along with two fellow members of the Tribunal Steering Committee, Nina Farnia and Helia Dutagi, have just published at Black Agenda Report a position paper that really identifies with great clarity the position of the Tribunal on sanctions and imperialism. And I'll put that link in the chat and encourage you to spread that widely. So with that, let me welcome Dr. Corinna Mullin.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, and thank you to my fellow panelists and to everyone in the audience for taking the time to join us on a Sunday afternoon. Really appreciate it. And as Charlotte mentioned, the publication in Black Agenda Report of the position paper and working framework for the Tribunal, I believe Helia posted in the chat, and that really is the framework for my talk today. That my talk is really drawing from this position paper. So if you're interested in learning more, please have a look at the paper itself. So since the end of the Cold War, the world has witnessed an unprecedented proliferation of sanctions regimes, particularly by the United Nations Security Council, the European Union, and the United States. As the world's leading imperialist power, it is not surprising that the US currently deploys the largest number of sanctions against other countries as a means to reinforce its hegemony in the world system. Currently, 1/3 of the globe is impacted by US sanctions. We all know that sanctions kill and are just as deadly and destructive as other kinds of warfare. Sanctions by design cause untold death and devastation, a reality laid bare, especially in the current health crisis. However, the International People's Tribunal on US imperialism, sanctions, blockades, and economic coercive measures urges us to look beyond solely their humanitarian impact. We approach sanctions as an inherently violent tool of hybrid warfare designed to uphold racialized uneven development in the world system, rooted in histories of colonialism and enslavement, designed to enable capital accumulation in the imperialist core. They do so by facilitating unequal exchange in labor and trade, enabling global South surplus value drain. As Lawrence Smith put it, sanctions serve to justify and conceal theft through asset freezes and seizures at a rate only previously accomplished through invasion and occupation. US sanctions trigger currency devaluation, inflation, and increased unemployment, as well as reduced access to food, power, industrial equipment, and medicine. In other words, in the hands of US empire, sanctions are a neo-colonial tool designed to immiserate the global South workforce by undermining the capacity for social reproduction as part of a broader political project to prevent global South development, destabilize and bend global South states to the will of the imperialist core. The Tribunal is a collective effort to build systems of accountability rooted in global cross-movement solidarity, both within and outside of the law, to challenge the violence of imperialism through sanctions. We interrogate sanctions not from the perspective of those who enforce them, but from the perspective of those most impacted by them, namely the peoples of Asia, Africa, and South America. Sanctions are a means of disciplining and controlling global South sovereignty and blocking the emergence of a multipolar world order. There is also, of course, a discursive dimension to this violence, as sanctions are justified through racialized tropes such as failed state, authoritarian, dictatorship, state sponsor of terrorism, all of which are used to dehumanize and, like the white man's burden of the colonial era, to reinforce the West's ostensible position as civilized and humane, all as a cover, of course, for plunder, death, and destruction. Like other forms of imperialist intervention, military and economic, to function, sanctions require the collaboration of a whole host of imperialist and capitalist institutions, including the international banking system, international financial institutions such as the IMF and World Bank, and the collaboration of course, other capitalist core states. Sanctions are also critical to protect and promote the interest of Western monopoly capital at the expense of global South development by targeting both global South and indigenous public and private capital. For example, in Zimbabwe, the first country we will cover in our tribunal, the US has imposed unilateral sanctions for close to 20 years following successful land reform that undermined the power of settler monopolies in Zimbabwe, limiting access as a result for global North monopoly capital. While the EU has eased its sanctions over the years, the US still maintains these sanctions and continues to expand them. Although we know the US government claims these, like past sanctions, are targeted, of course, we know they impact the entire economy and population. As Elena Duhan, the UN Special Rapporteur on unilateral coercive measures and human rights explained, over the last 20 years, sanctions and various forms of overcompliance with sanctions have had an insidious ripple effect on the economy of Zimbabwe and on the enjoyment of fundamental human rights, including access to health, food, safe drinking water and sanitation, education and employment, also limiting the government's ability to guarantee the functioning of public institutions, delivery of services, and maintenance of essential infrastructure, ultimately, of course, undermining the right of development of the Zimbabwean people. Cuba, targeted, of course, for its successful and world-inspiring socialist revolution, is one of the most renowned and stark examples of the impact of sanctions in causing severe political economic upheaval. As Minister of Foreign Affairs Bruno Rodrigues Parilla put it in a speech to the UN General Assembly this past November, the blockade is, quote, a deliberate act of economic warfare with the purpose of preventing financial income to the country, destroying the government's capacity to attend to the needs of the population, causing the economy to collapse, and creating a situation of ungovernability. The Minister of Foreign Affairs quoted a surprisingly frank acknowledgement of the aim of sanctions in 1960 by then Under Secretary of State Lester Mallory, which in his words is to, quote, cause disillusionment, discouragement, reduce wages, cause hunger, despair, and the overthrow of the government. Recent reports put the amount lost to the Cuban economy from this blockade, from the crippling blockade over 6 decades of the brutal imperialist blockade on the country at more than 154 billion US dollars at current prices. The noose was tightened on Cuba under Trump, with over 243 new sanctions imposed, additional sanctions that have been maintained in full force by Biden since his election, including maintaining the designation of Cuba as a state's quote unquote state sponsor of terrorism. Between August 2021 and February 2022 alone, $3.8 billion were lost to the Cuban economy. As Minister Rodrigues Parilla asked in his presentation, what would Cuba be like today if it had those resources? What could Cuba have done? What would Cuba's economy be like? As a testament to the strength of its revolution, even in the face of these multiple forms of violence, Cuba has managed to surpass all expectations in terms of development, making incredible advances in the fields of education, technology, agriculture, and of course, medicine. In the context of COVID, the world witnessed that socialist states were far more successful at managing the public health crisis than capitalist countries, with Cuba leading the way despite limited resources and the strangling blockade. For example, Cuba's impressive biotech industry is proof of the power of a public health policy that places innovation in the service of human life. This enabled Cuba to develop its own vaccines despite enormous obstacles, and 85% of the country's COVID treatment protocol was developed using national sources. The island boasts one of the top 10 vaccine rates in the world, and its vaccines have been exported to multiple countries. Cuba also sent its renowned Henry Reeve International Medical Brigades to over 40 countries during the pandemic. And this is in addition to Cubans already working in 58 countries. However, US sanctions have still had a detrimental effect on public health efforts in Cuba by restricting access to crucial inputs for manufacturing, as well as necessary medical supplies. In fact, there were 60 sanctions levied on Cuba during the pandemic, making the blockade even more genocidal. Thus, even in countries with strong public health systems, US sanctions have hindered governments' ability to address the public health crisis by delaying shipments, restricting access to international markets, and reducing access to necessary supplies. This has real and detrimental impacts on people's life chances in countries under US sanctions. And of course, this is not just in the context of the current pandemic, but across the board in terms of public health. Even outside of the global pandemic, countless lives have been lost due to sanctions. Exact numbers are difficult to quantify because no international tally of casualties related to economic sanctions is recorded, which obfuscates their fatal impact. Some report close to 100,000 people have died in Venezuela since 2017 due to US sanctions. And of course, we all remember the more than 500,000 Iraqi children who died because of US sanctions, a price Secretary of State Madeleine Albright notoriously said was worth it. Further, because economic sanctions interfere with the functioning of essential infrastructure, including electrical grids, water treatment and distribution facilities, transportation hubs, and communication networks, by blocking access to key industrial inputs such as fuel, raw materials, and replacement parts, they lead to droughts, famines, disease, and abject poverty. They also target countries' ability to handle natural and climate change disasters, all of which of course, are capitalist and imperialist induced as well. And all of this results in the death of millions. The power of sanctions is rooted in US dollar hegemony, going back to the 1971 US government decision to withdraw the dollar from the gold standard and increase pressure on central banks around the world to hold monetary reserves in US Treasury securities and other US financial assets, as well as the 1973 so-called oil crisis, when the US basically required Saudi Arabia to invest its windfall profits from the sale of oil or petrodollars into US banks and bonds in exchange for arms sales and political support, leading to the system of dollar seigniorage. However, US dollar hegemony is being challenged today. And this is where the resistance elements comes in, and which this tribunal is really a part of, by the rise of a multipolar world order. And that opens up new possibilities in terms of resisting sanctions. BRICS and sanctioned countries have begun to build new institutions that could circumvent the reliance on the dollar. And this is a big challenge to SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications Network, which is run through the US Federal Reserve's clearinghouse interbank payment services and its Fedwire fund service. Countries under unilateral sanctions, such as Iran and Russia, were cut off from the SWIFT system, which connects 11,000 financial institutions across the globe. After the 2014 US sanctions, Russia created the System for Transfer of Financial Messages, which is mainly designed for domestic users, but also works with banks from Central Asia, China, India, and Iran. In 2015, China created the cross-border interbank payment system run by the People's Bank of China, which is gradually being used by other central banks. Alongside these developments by Russia and China are a range of other options, such as payment networks rooted in new advances in financial technology and central bank digital currencies. In response to anxieties around sanctions, many countries in the global South are thinking more about working to develop these non-dollar trade and investment systems using local currencies. There is also talk of the creation of a South American digital currency called the SUR, in order to create stability in interregional trade and establish monetary sovereignty. Before ending, I would just like to return to the question of resistance to imperialist sanctions. In addition to state-led regional forms of resistance, we now have a growing grassroots resistance movement to imperialist sanctions, a movement that is extremely exciting, and many and all of the people on this panel and all of our co-sponsoring and endorsing organizations are a part of. This movement involves many different kinds of tactics and strategies, from generating material forms of solidarity and support for sanctioned peoples to political education, making connections to the struggles of oppressed peoples in the belly of the beast, as well as organizing protests and much more. The People's Tribunal is really proud and excited to be part of this burgeoning movement. The People's Tribunal aims to build international consensus against the illegality of sanctions and contribute to building an international anti-imperialist movement targeting the United States. In addition to political education, organizing and mobilization, there is a legal component. The tribunal will identify legal causes of action to deploy either in international and or US courts. People's tribunals make decisions that may not be binding and do not have the force of law, but their achievements in a political and discursive register inspire and provide the tools necessary for present and future forms of organizing. People's tribunals allow the oppressed to judge the powerful, defining the content as well as scope of the procedures, which reverses the norm of the powerful creating and implementing the law as it does under capitalism. There is a long tradition of radical organizers using the law to put racial capitalism and imperialism on trial. And this goes back, and probably even before this, but as we know, to the 1951 Communist Party, US Communist Party Civil Rights Congress, We Charge Genocide petition, which was brought to the UN and indicted the political economic system of capitalism and white supremacy for inflicting numerous forms of structural and physical violence on Black people in the US, as well as drawing parallels to US imperialist violence abroad. It also includes the 1966 Russell Tribunal on US imperialist intervention in Vietnam, and later Russell Tribunals dealing with the US-backed Brazilian and Argentinian military dictatorships in 1964 and 76, respectively. The US-backed coup in Chile in 1973, the US and European interventions against Iraq in 1990 and 2003. The Black Panther Party also used the People's Tribunal model to hold racist institutions to account. More recently, the 2016 International Tribunal for Democracy in Brazil, the 2018 International People's Tribunal on the Philippines, the 2007 International Tribunal on Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, the 2008 International Tribunal on US colonial crimes against Puerto Rico, and the recent 2021 Spirit of Mandela International Tribunal. The International People's Tribunal on US imperialism, sanctions, blockades, and economic coercive measures draws from and contributes to this radical tradition of using international law to hold to account the very hierarchies and systems of oppression it was designed to uphold. We look forward to working with all our comrades here and beyond to building this movement. And thank you again to everyone for organizing and being here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Corinna, for your presentation today. And thank you for raising these key thoughts for us to follow through on, not only as we continue with the panel today, but also as we continue to organize the tribunal. I'm reminded of a quote from Jose Maria Sison, who is the Filipino communist leader and an internationalist revolutionary who passed away on Friday evening after 83 years in the struggle, who said, "We may count as forces of resistance from below those non-imperialist states that stand up to defend their national independence against imperialism. In fact, the US has launched the most violent wars of aggression against such states, which have included Iraq, the former Yugoslavia, and Afghanistan in recent times. It has also emboldened and supported the Israeli Zionists to occupy Palestine and suppress the Palestinian resistance. And as a consequence, we see the steady growth of armed and other forms of resistance in countries directly or indirectly targeted by the United States. In addition, the resurgence of mass protest actions against war and against imperialism in the imperialist countries reflects not only a high sense of solidarity in the people in such countries for other peoples, but also the growing discontent over the crisis in the world capitalist system. And in many ways, this call, even though it is 19 years old, is something that is still very relevant for us today as we continue with the tribunal. And so next, we're very honored to welcome Dr. Bikrum Gill, who is a professor in political science at Virginia Tech University, who will be speaking next. Welcome, Bikrum.
Thank you, Charlotte. And yeah, I'm happy to be here to share some thoughts on I guess the sanctions regime and on the tribunal. Thank you, Corinna. That was a wonderful opening talk. I think a lot of the ground I was going to cover has been covered, but I will try to focus on 2 or 3 points, maybe to build on some of what was just discussed. So I want to focus on, I think, especially 3 points in my comments. First, I think I want to focus on representing, and this is something I really appreciate about the focus of the tribunal, thinking about sanctions in terms of how they emerge or articulated as a particular sort of level of structural conflict, right? A form of, let's say, a structural restoration of the structural framework of capitalist imperialism. So I want to think about sanctions as a technique, as a tactic of counter-revolutionary colonial restoration that really particularly functions to restore the kind of underlying relations of capitalist imperialism as a global system of rule. And I'm going to really, I think, draw here on Frantz Fanon's idea of what he calls violence in the international context, which is really going to point to some of the contradictions of both capitalist imperialism and anti-imperialism as a project. And it's within these contradictions that sanctions emerge. And the challenge of confronting sanctions, I think we'll see, are quite immense. And then a second point that I want to focus on is, okay, so one is sanctions as a means of restoring the structural framework of capitalist imperialism. A second point I want to discuss is sanctions more in terms of the ideological impacts of sanctions. And here, what I want to think about is how in reimposing the structural framework of capitalist imperialism, the sanctions regime has the effect of often, unfortunately, confusing the political projects of anti-imperialism, especially in the core. So here I want to emphasize that because sanctions are often articulated, they're not articulated, okay, we are restoring imperialism, they're articulated often in the language of democracy promotion, of human rights, of anti-authoritarianism, and it often leaves anti-imperialists in the core confused and divided, as they and often has the impact of generating an abandonment of solidarity with third world sovereign development projects, right? And that's not to say that third world sovereign development projects don't have their own contradictions and problems, but it's concerning the way in which the sanctions regime sort of ends up structuring politics in the imperial core, and an abandonment of third world sovereign development projects, and really it leaves us with nothing other than a certain academic NGO approach to questions of underdevelopment in the South, right? So I want to focus on that as a second point, and then maybe end with what's really at stake. I think with the tribunal is clarifying the objective of sanctions, right? To try to, I guess, overcome that ideological weight that confuses anti-imperialism in the core, and to return to us what is really at stake in opposing sanctions, which is defending the right of sovereign development in the global South. So I think what I'm going to begin first with just an overview of what the structure of capitalist imperialism is and how sanctions emerge out of this structure of capitalist imperialism. So capitalism, as I'm sure many of the comrades in attendance today would be aware, but just to as an overview, though, capitalism has functioned since the long 16th century as a world system, right? So this is really important. It functions on a world scale around two primary contradictions. We have the capital labor contradiction, and the second contradiction, the one I want to focus on more today, is the core periphery dynamic, which constitutes actually the grounds upon which the capital labor relation emerges and subsequently comes to stabilize its contradictions so it can be reproduced on an expanding scale. So what is this core periphery contradiction or relation that is so essential to capitalist imperialism? So this is a world scale contradiction that's structured upon a denial of sovereignty to the colonized and imperially subjugated peoples of the periphery. And this denial of sovereignty enables the colonizing and imperial core to exhaustively appropriate a world scale surplus through which capital accumulation and the reproduction of labor in the core can be stabilized. So the denial of sovereignty, the denial of sovereign capacity, either directly or indirectly, is a core feature of capitalism as an imperialist world system. Now, it is at the moment when resistance is waged from the peripheries in the form of decolonization and anti-imperialism, that the decolonization and anti-imperialism demonstrates a capacity to withstand the armed violence that is at the root of the denial of sovereignty, that sanctions emerge as a key strategy of the dominant capitalist states of the core to reimpose a diminished sovereign capacity upon the peripheries. Okay, so sanctions are essentially a response to decolonization and anti-imperialism. I mean, that's a really key point to put up front and center, is that sanctions are not simply a means of inter-imperial rivalry. It's not a technique of disciplining unruly states. It's primarily emerging as a technique of the dominant imperial states in response to those states that especially challenge the material basis of colonization and imperialism. Now we can understand this, how this plays out a little more by thinking about how sanctions operate within a framework of international law that has been devised by the imperial powers. So from the origins of international law in the 16th century, international law has accorded Euro-Western imperialist states the right to wage endless war upon the peoples of the peripheries when the people of the peripheries deny the imperial core states the right to conduct free commerce or free trade in their territories. Resisting Euro-Western commerce is taken as evidence of an inherent irrational despotism that calls into question the sovereign capacity of the colonized. Now, so at the moment in which historically over the history of the capitalist imperialist system, the moment in which colonized and imperially subjugated people call into question the right of core countries to conduct commerce in their territories, this is the right at the moment at which international law accords Euro-Western states the right to impose sanctions, right? And one thing I want to mention here, and this is in relation to the second point I was talking about, is that since the origins of capitalist imperialism, the origins of international law, there's always been a secondary kind of human rights paradigm that emerges underneath the denial of sovereignty. So once sovereignty is denied, colonized and imperialized people can press for recognition of rights under Western sovereignty, right? Under the rule of Western capital, right? And this is something that elsewhere in my work I've identified as something that I call the Las Casas paradigm, right? Because Bartolomé de las Casas, a 16th century kind of human rights figure in the Spanish colonization of the Americas, often argued in favor of human rights for indigenous peoples, but without ever questioning the exclusive sovereign right of European colonial powers, right? So on the one hand, you have a disciplining mechanism when colonized peoples seek to call into question Euro-Western right to commerce in their territories. And on the other hand, you have this human rights paradigm, which is, I think, more consonant with the NGO academic paradigm today, which is complicit in the denial of sovereignty to colonized peoples, but seeks to offer some measure of recognition underneath Western sovereignty, which I'll try to elaborate later on. So now to clarify how and when sanctions emerge and the function they play in the restoration of capitalist imperialism, sanctions emerge at precisely that moment when the colonized reject this Las Casas paradigm, right, and actually reclaim formal political sovereignty by returning to colonialism a greater violence that alone can make it yield. Now, while at that moment, while the ex-colonies may now have formal political sovereignty, they confront a contradiction in the economic sphere that constrains their ability to overcome the material deprivation of colonialism. Now, this contradiction consists of the imperial core's retention of control of the capital accumulated from the colonial surplus drain, which leaves the post-colonial state without the means to reorient their resources towards a form of national development that can overcome the poverty, hunger, and overall underdevelopment inflicted by colonialism. It is in their monopoly power over the capital generated from the colonies that the imperial states grasp the logic of sanctions as an instrument of war that, in light of the increasing difficulty of subduing decolonization by armed force, alone can regenerate in neocolonial guise the underlying principles of the capitalist world system. The logic of sanctions is captured in Fanon's characterization of the capital flight from periphery to core that accompanies decolonization. In plain words, the colonial power says, this is quoting Fanon, in plain words, the colonial power says, if you want independence, take it and starve. And this has the effect of imposing a condition of dependency, which forces a reperipheralization of the post-colonial state as its access to capital becomes contingent upon a renewal of the inherited colonial economy. So just to maybe briefly recap that, the point here is that the bind that global South and peripheral states face is they achieve formal decolonization, but they have a deficit of capital because the history of colonization is a history of draining resources from periphery to core. And it is that monopoly power that the core can exercise over the capital drained through colonization, through which they can reimpose a disciplinary power on states of the periphery. So this is kind of the structural bind that states in the periphery find themselves within. And so those states that have been particularly targeted by the sanctions regimes are those states that have actually started to implement policies or impose measures that can overcome that deficit that is the result of the legacy of colonialism, the deficit of capital, the deficit of access to investable resources with which they can undertake sovereign development. Now, what are the means through which, what are these specific policies? So these are things like nationalization of resources, things like agrarian land reform that can overturn the colonial property structures that facilitate a drain of surplus from periphery to core. Right, and if you look historically, it is at those states at which sanctions have been most acutely targeted, right? So I mean, we can look at, Corinna talked about Zimbabwe, which is a really excellent example when Zimbabwe seeks to overturn the inherited colonial property structures. They are subject to sanctions, where the neighboring state of South Africa never actually undertakes any form of radical agrarian land reform that overcomes the inherited colonial property structure, and South Africa is not subject to sanctions, right? So I think that's a very clear distinction of what's at stake in the sanctions regime of trying to reimpose the colonial property structures that facilitate a surplus drain from periphery to core. So I think we see whether the sanctions targeted against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, whether sanctions targeted against Cuba, against Zimbabwe, against Iran, against Venezuela, clearly sanctions are targeted at those states that seek to challenge the Euro-Western capitalist right to commerce in their territories through projects like nationalization and land reform. And I think that's a very key point here. And how are they able to impose sanctions on a Venezuela, on an Iran, on a Cuba? It's because they continue to possess monopoly control over the surplus capital that was generated through the history of capitalism and imperialism. So what would one means be of overcoming this? Well, something like a project of reparations, right? Of reparations for colonization and imperialism would be a way to remove the material source of power through which poor states are able to impose sanctions on the periphery. So that's, I think, and that's a point that, Fanon raised very early in the initial post-colonial period, right? And I think as we're contesting the sanctions regime, it's maybe important to continually come back to this framework of reparations as actually what should be the framework, not the sanctions framework. I just wanted to briefly, and then I'll end my talk, but briefly elaborate on the two cases of Zimbabwe and Iran, I think, because they really bring this point home quite clearly. So if you look at, for example, the sanctions that were imposed on Iran in the 1990s under the Clinton administration and afterwards, and the sanctions that are imposed on Zimbabwe in the early 2000s, these sanctions are being deployed and intensified in a context in which in Zimbabwe and Iran, where you have states, these two states especially, undertaking forms of either economic nationalization and land redistribution or forms of military, let's say, development of military capacity that can ground regional sovereignty in a way that challenges Western imperialism, right? So you have Iran in the 1990s and 2000s playing a key role in supporting organizations like Hezbollah and other regional resistance organizations that can challenge the Oslo framework, right? Within which, say, the right to Palestinian self-determination is captured under Western sovereignty, right? That the Palestinians essentially have to beg the West to recognize them as a state rather than commanding and compelling whether the Zionist state or Western states to submit to Palestinian national liberation, which is what the Iranian support for an organization like Hezbollah was quite central in, let's say, introducing a different calculus in terms of the possibility for the realization of real concrete sovereignty in the region. And it's at that point that sanctions are imposed on Iran in the 1990s under the Clinton administration, again in the 2000s. And we have to see that this is happening at a moment in which Hezbollah and other organizations are actually challenging and bringing to crisis the Oslo framework. In a similar way, Zimbabwe, when the land reclamation happens in the late 1990s and 2000s, is calling into question the post-apartheid human rights framework that it consolidates in South Africa in the 1990s, where the absence of land reform in South Africa kind of removes the land redistribution question from the table, but it's forcefully put back on the table by the Zimbabwe movement, and then the imperial states impose sanctions on Zimbabwe at that moment. So I think in both instances, we can see how sanctions function as a means to deny the material basis of actual decolonization and actual sovereign restoration. And I think I'll just conclude with this point that what's at stake in, I think, charging the United States with imperialism and bringing to light what their objective is with sanctions, right, as a means of denying the right of sovereign development, the right of developing like the material basis for real actual sovereignty, is that the sanctions regime has also functioned to really confuse, I feel, a large portion of the quote unquote left in the core countries, because they seem to just follow the ideological line that the sanction regimes articulates, right? That, well, sanctions are imposed on Iran or Zimbabwe for the purpose of a democracy or a human rights, which leads very often, again, to the abandonment of solidarity with actual projects for instituting sovereign third world development and sovereign national liberation. And so what all that we're left with otherwise is kind of like an NGO model where these states lack the basically sovereign industrial basis to have concrete development. And so they're constantly under basically the sovereign authority of Western monopoly capital. So I think what's at stake in contesting the sanctions regime is contesting the right of Western capital to maintain its monopolies over core technologies, over what Samir Amin calls the imperialist rent. And it's the necessity to reject this kind of the global sovereignty of Western capital, an academic NGO model that operates underneath that, and to support real anti-imperial sovereign national development. So I'll end my talk there. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Bikrum, for this powerful presentation and for framing these important issues, particularly around reparations, around decolonization, and around the meaningful impact on the left, particularly in imperialist countries, and the responsibility to support meaningful actual resistance and national development in those countries who are targeted by imperialism. Next, we are going to be hearing today from David Paul, who is representing Sanctions Gill, which is another coalition of organizations that is working to fight against US sanctions around the world, and also had an important role to play with his comrades in defending the Venezuelan embassy in the United States. So welcome, David.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me to and it's really incredible information and inspiration from the other speakers. Inviting me to talk about the US assault on the Venezuelan embassy in 2019 and show how it's an example of the US's contempt for the sovereignty of other nations. You can hear me okay, right? Okay. As a tool, we often call it sanctions because it's a briefer term and it's the one that's commonly used, but it does kind of soften the reality of they are, damaging coercive measures. And as a tool, as the speakers have talked to already, is a tool in the ongoing war against all who defy imperial domination. I want to give a little historical context on Venezuela leading up to this event, and also mention some key points from the Sanctions Gill campaign new book, Sanctions, the Wrecking Ball in a Global Economy. It's an anthology of voices about sanctions, includes a toolkit for activists and other resources. With the election of Hugo Chavez over 20 years ago, emerged a new sense of dignity and desire for independence from US imperial control. Ever since Venezuela has been at the epicenter of this historical class struggle for self-determination for the people of the global South, Chavez invested the country's wealth into the social programs, promoting regional integration, and the US has tried to undermine this process ever since and force regime change, even supporting a coup and his kidnapping in 2002. After his death in 2013, there was a huge drop in oil prices, which greatly reduced government revenues. The US began to demonize the newly elected President Maduro, who was committed to continue Chavez's policies. In 2015, Obama's absurd decree that Venezuela is an extraordinary threat to the security of the United States paved the way for Trump to greatly increase sanctions, calling the 2018 election of Maduro fraudulent with absolutely no evidence. After receiving a call from Trump's Secretary of State, the right-wing National Assembly head, Juan Guaido, declared himself president, and Trump recognized him as such, even though he never received a single vote in Venezuela and violated Venezuelans' own constitution. The US took over the Venezuelan refineries in the US, seized billions of dollars in Venezuelan assets, and began this economic war, threatening sanctions on other countries and corporations that wanted to trade with Venezuela, greatly limiting Venezuela's ability to get loans, purchase vital goods for basic services, repair infrastructure like water and electricity, pay for salaries. This aggression involved also mercenary attacks, assassination attempts, a sabotage of the electric grid, seizures of ships, blocking of financial transactions. This ongoing coup included permitting opposition takeover of the Venezuelan consulate in New York and other offices in DC. But the final prize was the Venezuelan embassy in Washington. Trump broke off diplomatic relations and ordered Venezuelan diplomats to leave. Activists from Code Pink, Popular Resistance, and Answer Coalition asked permission from the Venezuelan government to stay in the embassy in order to protect it from being taken over, and invited others to join until a protective power agreement, which could take place, where third countries would watch over the embassies until negotiations worked out a solution. The US refused this agreement. Initially, up to 70 people stayed in the embassy. We had educational and cultural activities and events, press releases and conferences, interviews. And after a military coup by Guaido failed on April 30th, a disappointed and angry mob of right-wing opposition surrounded the embassy for 24 hours with constant threats, assaults on supporters trying to bring food, terrorized them with sirens and strobe lights, drilling into and breaking doors and windows to try to get into the embassy, destroying security cameras, cutting off electricity and water eventually. All the while, the Secret Service and DC police watched and even aided the opposition mob, arresting 2 of our supporters for trying to throw a baguette and a cucumber to our window, but never detaining at all the opposition mob who assaulted our supporters. We had eventually reduced our number to 4 people to preserve food. At the front door, the police delivered an unsigned letter stating that Guaido's fake ambassador Vecchio says we have to leave. We stated that the police would be violating international law, the UN Charter, the Vienna Convention, and endanger other embassies if they entered to remove us. After Jesse Jackson came with more press representatives and was assaulted trying to deliver us food, the following day, our 37th day, the police illegally entered the building, demolishing the back door, and arrested us. We found out that similar attacks later were on embassies of Venezuela were happening in other countries, Chile, Brazil, Costa Rica, and others, with physical battles with the opposition and the police. We were charged with interfering with the protective services of the federal government, a rarely used statute to protect diplomats, but never a building. The judge was ignorant and hostile to us from the beginning, prohibiting any context. We couldn't tell the jury that Maduro was president, only Guaido. We could not mention anything about Venezuela. We could not say we had permission from the government. All of this was because the judge said it would confuse the jury. But it was just this lack of information that jurors later told us was the source of their confusion, resulting in a hung jury, and the federal charges against us were eventually dropped. They offered and we accepted a minor misdemeanor charge to avoid an expensive new trial. Like the government in our trial, the mainstream media coverage of the situation in Venezuela avoids any context of sanctions, knowing that the US has seized billions of dollars from their accounts, blocked their main source of income, needed to purchase food and medicines, produce their own fuel. They published photos of empty store shelves, long lines of waiting for gas, claiming that that's proof that the Venezuelan government is corrupt and can't manage its economy. Another major ongoing attack on Venezuelan sovereignty is the US kidnapping of diplomat Alex Saab while he was traveling to secure deals to get food and medicines for Venezuela. And this kidnapping was in clear violation of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. He's been imprisoned and initially tortured for 2 years, now on trial in Miami. Another farce of a trial where the ones trying to defend sovereignty are on trial, not the ones violating it. He's essentially a prisoner of war, and his trial is purely political, since there's no legal justification. This case is an example of the gross disregard for sovereignty, where the US is trying to insist that it gets to decide who's the diplomat of another country. Recently, the major opposition parties in Venezuela have distanced themselves from Guaido, participated in the last 2 elections, stating that they were fair and transparent, signing agreements with the government, which has led to some limited funds being released to the UN for medicines and infrastructure, but still hundreds of sanctions still continue. Biden did this long-awaited review of sanctions last year, saying it was to assess if sanctions were affecting the response to COVID. But his findings mentioned nothing about COVID eventually, and stated just the frustration of the US that countries are finding ways around the sanctions. And so the US must double down its efforts to strengthen sanctions. ignoring again the UN Human Rights Commission's reports on the deadly impact of sanctions on the health of the most vulnerable populations, even during the pandemic in sanctioned countries. In Venezuela, resulting in the past few years, as it was already mentioned, up to 100,000 deaths from an increase in infant mortality, including HIV patients, diabetic patients, patients on dialysis, and the continued stress of chronic shortages in many areas where they have running water only a few hours a week, frequent power outages, not being able to find and afford medicines for sick family members, perform needed surgeries, and even children with cancer whose funds for bone marrow transplants have been blocked have died in the last couple of years. As the other speakers have highlighted, the Sanctions Kill book basic is trying to raise awareness about how sanctions are a form of economic terrorism that violates international law, the sovereignty of nations, and creates massive suffering. They show, the book tries to show also that it is clearly a tool to maintain global hegemony, to maintain wealth for corporate elites. The racist and murderous mentality of manifest destiny now continues in the US well-documented plans of full spectrum dominance, the plan for the new American century, and what has become a real global Monroe Doctrine, where instead of cooperation to solve problems of world hunger, poverty, and war, US elites see the world through a sociopathic lens of competition and greed. These unilateral coercive measures used against any country are used against any country that tries to organize their society in a way that doesn't provide a beneficial climate for big business interests, that they profit so they can profit off at the expense of the needs of the people. They also, the goal is to destabilize the economies of these countries so that the people will demand regime change and end the suffering. If this is not successful, it still sends a message of what could happen to others who defy this US agenda. It's truly not hyperbole to say the US is an international gangster. It points out, the book also points out that most of the US population completely is unaware of sanctions due to it being rarely reported in the media. One powerful tool to maintain this situation, even with the gross obvious hypocrisy, and is the ability to promote the myth that as was mentioned before, as the US acts to promote human rights and democracy in the world, while at the same time it denies food and medicine to millions of people, promotes coups, and interferes with elections. It claims a rules-based order among nations, while it violates all treaties and international law, and has the arrogance that saying that other countries must follow US laws or face consequences. It is especially harsh on countries that promote socialist policies, trying to use their resources to help the majority of their people, because this creates the threat of that good example where the US population may see a poor country providing free healthcare and education and possibly demand that we have the same in the US. There's a quote by the Elliot Abrams, Trump's envoy in charge of Venezuelan policy, who said, we work hard all around the world to show that socialism doesn't work, and we can not let Venezuela be an exception. Many countries in Latin America and Africa are standing up to the political bullying of the US when it tries to tell other nations who they can have relations with, including rejecting sanctions on Russia. This book contains a number of resources on work against sanctions, and hopefully by using it and through the work of this important tribunal, more people will see that the US's use of coercive measures are a form of war and violence, a threat to the millions of people and to peace. It is vital to expand this campaign of education about sanctions, be in solidarity with the sanctioned peoples, amplifying their voices, learn from their resistance, and unify our efforts to hold our government accountable for its crimes. We feel that this important tribunal and sources like the Sanctions Kill book will help in that effort. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for your comments and for the important work that Sanctions Kill is doing and that you did in the Venezuelan embassy to take a meaningful stand against US imperialism, especially as it is conducted through the forms of sanctions, blockades, and coercive economic measures. Today, our final speaker that we'll be hearing from is Eunha Jeong from Nodutdol for Korean Community Development, who will be speaking more about sanctions and how they affect the people of the Korean Peninsula. Please welcome Eunha.
Thank you for that introduction, Charlotte. And thank you to those who organized this panel and to everyone who's joining us today. I am Eunha, a member of Nodutdol, a revolutionary organization of Koreans and comrades organizing for a world free of imperialism and for Korea's reunification and national liberation. I wanted to mention our fellow Nodutdol member, Erica Jeong, has a chapter on US sanctions in the book that David mentioned. And that chapter goes more into depth on the local and human impacts of those 70 years of US sanctions against North Korea. For today's panel, I will be discussing how US sanctions against North Korea are situated within the history of US imperialism and offer some analyses on the use of sanctions and the movement opposing them. To anyone willing to think critically for even a moment about US interference in Korea, it is clear that US sanctions against North Korea have little to do with humanitarian concerns and everything to do with the US's desperate desire to retain unipolar power and militarily surround Russia and China. The political and economic significance of Korea is central to the Cold War anti-communist campaign that continues to drive US policy today. At the end of World War II, the US partitioned Korea, occupied the South, and replaced the Japanese imperial flag by raising the US imperial flag. From 1945 to 1950, the US enabled rightist persecution and massacre of tens of thousands of Koreans fighting for national liberation, overthrew Korea's people-led government, and installed a US-backed rightist military dictatorship. The US officially began sanctions against North Korea in 1950, after the fighting escalated into an all-out international war. This war is known as the Korean War in the US, the Fatherland Liberation War in North Korea, and the 625 or June 25 War in occupied South Korea, named after the date the war is said to have officially started. Under the authority of the United Nations Command or UNC forces led by the US, 22 countries militarily fought on the side of the US against North Korea and China, and many others provided aid to US and South Korean troops. 3 days after the official start of that war, on June 28th, the US imposed a total embargo on exports to North Korea on the basis of the US Export Control Act of 1949, a sanctions act that preemptively targeted socialist nations. Significantly, it was during the Korean War that the US shifted from a creditor economy to a debtor economy because of its exorbitant military spending. Thus, it was in Korea that the US recalibrated how it operates as an imperialist war economy by making other countries bankroll its wars and military expansion. In 1946, 1 year post-World War II, and 4 years before the formal start of the Korean War, then US President Truman stated, quote, "World trade must be restored, and it must be restored to private enterprise," end quote. With this assertion, Truman made clear the key principle of US foreign policy. Any countries that attempted to decolonize and assert their own sovereignty in opposition to US interests would be disallowed from regulating world trade or excluded altogether. And this really touches on what Bikrum was saying and a lot of the overview that the previous panelists have said and discussed. This is the policy that has driven 70 years of US sanctions against North Korea. North Korea staunchly denies the US access to the value North Korean workers create and to the resources that their land provides. Because North Korea insists on Korean socialist self-governance and sovereignty, the US is intent on excluding them from the global economy. This is the same pattern of economic coercion and terrorizing we see with the over 8,000 sanctions that the US imposes against nearly 40 countries globally. And that's not including the impact of third-party sanctions and the effects of overcompliance. The US continues to impose sanctions on North Korea with the clear intention and belief in the right to corner, deprive, and starve North Koreans into submitting to US domination. This alone illustrates how truly barbaric the US is in its thinking and actions. US sanctions work to strangle intra-Korean relations and obstruct cooperation and trade between North and South Korea, and between North Korea and other economic and political partners. The US sabotaged the 2018 normalization talks between the North and South Korean leaders, which would have been a key step toward finally ending the Korean War. With this interference, the US also blocked the opening of the intra-Korea Railway, which would have connected the North and South railroads and further nurtured possibilities for reunification and peace on the peninsula. The US generates support for sanctions by obstructing a correct or empathetic understanding of Korea. This is done through intense anti-communist and racist propaganda and a near blackout of media that even faintly portrays North Korea with dignity and respect. To further prevent normalization of relations and block humanitarian aid, in 2017, the US imposed a travel ban on US citizens visiting North Korea. This travel ban prevents people with US passports from visiting and thus impedes our ability to build with and learn from our people in the North. By portraying North Korea as backward and primitive, leaders such as Kim Jong-un as irrational despots, and South Korea in need of quote unquote US protection, the US wants the world to believe that Koreans are incapable of self-governance and unworthy of full economic and political independence. This portrayal also creates a public that is more amenable to military invention and invasion, as we saw with Iraq and Libya. If we understand the core characteristics of imperialism today as a financial oligarchy, the economic division of the world, and the territorial division of the world among the imperialist powers, our analysis of sanctions must highlight the mechanisms of capitalism through which they are imposed and enforced. Though the analogy of sanctions as war or sanctions as warfare can productively express the humanitarian concerns, violence, and devastating effects of US sanctions, there are three aspects in which this narrative can be insufficient in its analysis or even counterproductive to our goals. One, it does not pinpoint and address the actual machinery that allows sanctions to harm people. The machinery of financialization, monopoly capitalism, and the workings of the liberal, quote unquote, free market. Two, the language of sanctions as war keeps us wedded to US constructions of legality and illegality, and therefore also ties us to US and Western ideations of peace as the absence of conflict rather than peace as decolonization and liberation. It also ties us to the limited binary of unarmed versus armed conflict and to the frameworks of liberal human rights and the institutions of human rights imperialism. And three, it is clear that war is not a deterrent for many, if not most, in the global North and the upper stratas of the working class and core nations. For example, many who identify as liberals, progressives, and leftists, particularly in the US, have nonetheless avidly supported pouring tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons into Ukraine, escalating sanctions and war against Russia, and further expansion of NATO. Additionally, while a full discussion of the role of nuclear weapons is beyond the scope of my time here today, it needs to be understood that opposing the US sanctions regime requires a critical approach to nuclear weapons and the non-proliferation regime. The symbiotic relationship between US sanctions, the annual US ROK war exercises, literally at North Korea's border and shores, and US demands for North Korea to give up their nuclear weapons program, all illustrate the multi-pronged nature of the US's campaign against North Korea and the contradictions between the US's rhetoric and reality. South Korea's military budget is around $48 billion US dollars, while North Korea's is around 1.5 billion. In other words, North Korea spends about 3% of what South Korea spends. The NYPD, New York City Police Department alone spends $11 billion annually, with US military spending at over 1.6 trillion each year. So how is this unarmed conflict? It obviously is not. Sanctions are enforced by banks, corporations, state bodies, politicians, and the US military. The US is a war economy, and the financialization component needs to be clearly articulated rather than conflated with its global network of 800 military bases. Sanctions should be understood as a social engineering of poverty for the global majority and wealth and domination for an elite minority. The ideological foundation for US sanctions is liberalism, and the economic mode is capitalism. This clarification is essential when addressing the illegitimacy or illegality of US sanctions. Both liberalism and capitalism predetermine the segregation of the world into two separate societies with two separate sets of laws, as is evident in colonial contexts since the advent of capitalism. The logic and legal basis for the segregation of the world into two societies is founded in the same liberalism upon which white supremacy, chattel slavery, and capitalism were established. The same liberalism that naturalizes colonialism and the law and order of white male property owners. The same liberalism that upholds individual freedom over collective liberation. This is the same imperialist social engineering that constructs the ghettos within our cities and towns throughout the US and the world. It is through the ideology and enforcement of liberalism and the economic expansion of capitalism that the US claims its sanctions are legal and justified. US sanctions adhere not to moral law or even international law, but to the imperialist laws that the US itself created. The same laws that allow the US military and police to act with impunity in the name of US interests. Conversely, what law does North Korea recognize? North Korea has always openly and staunchly supported Palestinian liberation, and to this day has never recognized the apartheid state of Israel as legitimate, denouncing it as an imperialist satellite of the US. US law allows for apartheid Israel to have an estimated 90 to 400 nuclear weapons, in open defiance of international law and with clear support from its sponsor, the US. The countries that the US dictates can or cannot have nuclear weapons is based on what best serves its interest, not what best serves to avoid nuclear war. The US kept nuclear weapons in South Korea until 1991, and today nuclear-capable aircraft and submarines can be readily deployed from South Korea. For over 30 years, North Korea negotiated with the US in good faith toward a denuclearization plan. At the same time, North Korea saw Libya give up their nuclear weapons program, also in good faith, and the subsequent illegal invasion, brutal murder of their leaders, and regime change that followed. To safeguard against that, North Korea has asserted their need to have a credible nuclear deterrent, and they believe that as a sovereign country, they have the right to do so. If we want to promote denuclearization and peace, we must assert that under moral law and the rights of sovereign nations, that both economic sanctions and military aggression must end. The US and its client states have tried to impose a false choice for North Korea between either deprivation and banishment from the global economy or a US-led annexation and occupation as the precondition for superficial peace and a quote-unquote rules-based order. Deprivation or annexation. Of course, this is not a real choice, and North Korea has understood that this is not a real negotiation. Instead, it is what Palestinian revolutionary Hassan Kanafani called a conversation between the sword and the neck. In its so-called negotiations, the US has always sought capitulation and total surrender. Kanafani understood this well, stating that he had never seen real diplomatic talks between the colonialist case and a national liberation movement. Sanctions are intended to force submission to US imperialism. However, what we can see is that this tactic motivates the people of sanctioned countries to mobilize their productive forces accelerate their efforts towards self-sufficiency, and work toward ensuring their right to self-determination. As multipolarity rises and the petrodollar loses its grip on the global economy, the effectiveness of US sanctions as a tool of unilateral control will continue to decline. This means that sanctioned states will gain renewed access to political and economic global partners. Multipolarity and delinking from the US dollar make it possible for long-targeted states like North Korea to have real choices in trade, diplomacy, and international relations, and real pathways to peace and reunification on the Korean Peninsula and throughout the world. As a final remark, I would like to highlight that US sanctions are intended to destroy not only North Korea's economy and ability to survive, but also our Korean kinship ties. Knowing the importance and strength of our love for Minjung, or the people, the US tries to break our cultural and historical bonds with each other. By banning travel to North Korea and defining North Koreans as a primary enemy, the US obstructs our ability to build relationships and work together in person. We at Nodutdol continue to call for an end to the travel ban so that we can visit the North and continue building toward peace and reunification throughout all of Korea, because Korea is one. And we ask you to join us in this call. And I will end there today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eunha, for this powerful presentation and for this call to action to join in the call that Korea is one, and for highlighting the ways in which the logics of capitalism and imperialism target people and nations around the world who continue to resist and to struggle against that imperial power. Just to let people know, we're going to be taking some questions. So if you have questions, we have a couple in the Q&A already, but please do put your questions in the Q&A, and you can direct them to any or all of the speakers, and we'll be happy to hear their analyses and responses to these questions. Before we get started with the questions, I just wanted to note something that has come up again and again in these presentations, and quite explicitly in yours, Eunha, around the separating of one people and dividing one people from itself. This is also something that comes up time and again in various uses of sanctions law, as Bikrum was discussing, particularly in terms of the criminalization of particular organizations and the use of so-called terror lists to criminalize, for example, Palestinian and Lebanese organizations, which have a main and primary target of, for example, just like we see with the sanctions on North Korea, just as we see in sanctions around the world, trying to separate people essentially from their families, communities, and loved ones, of attempting to separate, for example, Palestinians in exile or Lebanese people living outside Lebanon from the liberation movements happening in Palestine, Lebanon, and the Arab world. And so this impact of sanctions is felt on the individual level, the family level, the collective level, the national level, and the international level as well. And we've received a question from Kamo Makone, who is bringing up a point that I'm going to direct this first to Corinna, but I think there are other speakers that might have something to say about this topic as well, which is how do we challenge supporters of the Zionist state who use this argument about the violence of sanctions against calls for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against the Zionist regime of Israel? How do we defend sanctions with an anti-imperial agenda like those supporting the Palestinian people and those supporting Black South Africa?
Thanks, Charlotte, and thanks, Kiyomo, for that excellent question. Yeah, I think it's a really important point of clarification, and actually something that we include in our own position paper, and is we envision as really central to the work that we're doing with the People's Tribunal, is making this distinction between imperialist sanctions and sort of sanctions from below, the kind of grassroots sanctions and boycotts that really go back to all the anti-colonial struggles, as well as the Black Power struggle and other struggles of oppressed people in this country. And so I think that's a really important distinction to make, and also makes me think about the point that Bikrum raised in his presentation as well. And I just, want to thank all of the three panelists for their amazing presentations. And I learned so much from listening to you all. The point about decolonization, sanctions as an attack on, a sort of counter-revolutionary attack on decolonization. And so, really, when we think about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which itself has its roots in the struggle against British colonialism, and then leading up, and of course, against Zionist settler colonialism, and roots in the two intifadas, is as a tactic, one of the tactics of resistance to settler colonialism. As many people have pointed out, it's the floor, it's not the ceiling, but nonetheless, it's a really important tactic, and does the exact opposite of what Bikrum was describing as imperialist sanctions, as blocking decolonization and facilitating the continued surplus drain from the periphery to the core. Whereas what the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, in addition to all the other forms of resistance, what it does is the exact opposite, right? It's about decolonization, and it's about achieving, as Eunha was pointing out, this alternative world based on decolonization and sovereignty, global South sovereignty. And so I think fundamentally, when you think about the nature and aims and function of both, they are diametrically opposed, and that is what we need to keep saying. And yeah, I guess I would just end with that.
Can I jump in here?
Yes, please go ahead.
So I agree with everything, and I think Corinna put it really well in terms of the difference between the two. But I think I would, and of course, I'm a major supporter of BDS all the way through, but I wanted to maybe address the question in a different way, as a note of caution to the way in which the BDS project and BDS supporters can often be drawn into legitimizing the sanctions regime elsewhere, right? So I think that there's a real need, because there's a way in which, for example, the sanctions imposed against Iran, the distancing from an organization like Hezbollah or Hamas or these other organizations that are actually undertaking forms of, let's say, sovereign reclamation when it comes to hard power, right? When it comes to this question that phenomenon comes to, that colonization is rooted in armed violence, it is a fundamental reclamation of sovereignty is when the colonized can respond to this material basis, the violent basis of colonization, right? So the danger here with the BDS campaign is, if you look at what happened in South Africa, right? The South African campaign for sanctions basically abandons the hard power question, right? So it abandons the land question in South Africa, because it's essentially seeking, who is it speaking to when it's seeking sanctions, right? It's speaking to often Western monopoly capital, right? It's seeking to achieve recognition from those forces. And there's a danger with the Palestinian BDS movement today, I think, in seeking to say we are different than Hezbollah, we are different than those who are being sanctioned by Western capital, is you're actually abdicating the hard power through which Palestinian decolonization will not compromise on the land question or the right of return question, right? So I'm not sure if that's making entire sense, but there's a concern in which the outcome of BDS in South Africa left in place the structures of apartheid, right? And in a place in which, in Zimbabwe, where those structures are actually overturned, then sanctions are imposed, right? So there is a danger that BDS can operate within the framework of monopoly Western capital, right? And so if it can align itself, with the actual confrontation at the level of military force that is happening in the region as well. I think that is important, right? But so I just wanted to flag that as risk. It is different in the way I think Corinna really wonderfully articulated, but there is a risk, I think, that BDS can fall into alignment with sanctions, which won't actually lead to then Palestinian liberation. Yeah.
Thank you, both Corinna and Bikrum. I actually want to just kind of engage with both of your comments a little bit more, because I think that one of the things that Corinna rightly emphasized is the difference between popular boycott movements that are confronting imperialism and actually serving as a mechanism of support to the resistance. So if we think about what a boycott movement is supposed to be for Palestine, what the purpose of this is to do is to cut off the flow of money, weaponry, and arms to the colonizing power in order to provide a popular base of support for the resistance. And that includes the Palestinian resistance inside Palestine, the Lebanese resistance in Lebanon, and all of the forces of resistance in the region that are fighting back against US imperialism and Zionist colonization. And the danger comes in when there's an attempt to articulate this concept of a BDS movement as a separate thing from the Palestinian liberation movement, from the Palestinian resistance, and from the Arab regional and the overall regional resistance and liberation movement. So, which is confronting imperialism head on. So when we're asking people to take part in actions to boycott and isolate the Zionist regime, then what we're actually asking people to do is take part in actions that isolate the imperialist and normalize and support the resistance. And the danger comes in when we reframe this as sort of a liberal quest for recognition from the colonizing and imperialist powers themselves. So then the question becomes, well, why is there a double standard about Ukraine and about Palestine, when in fact we're talking about very different issues of colonization and very different political and economic interests for the imperialist powers? And that when we, especially outside Palestine or in solidarity with Palestine, are engaging in campaigns where we're demanding our institutions boycott the occupation regime, for example, or we're demanding or we're engaging in kind of a consumer boycott campaign, that this is a campaign that is not an alternative to the resistance. It is not an alternative to the various forces of resistance in the region, from the Palestinian and Lebanese armed resistance to Iran and other states that are fighting back against imperialism. It's not an alternative, but it's part and parcel of the same camp and the same path of progress. And the danger comes in when we allow there to be a separation imposed upon resistance, because then we run the risk of reigniting the extremely failed path of Oslo, which is when we think about Oslo and what it is, it's a path for a few comprador capitalists allied with imperialism to seek some kind of nominal recognition in the world of a safe space for capital and nominal recognition in the world of imperialism at the expense of any meaningful liberation and self-determination project. And so if we see Oslo through that light, then it makes perfect sense why we see terrorist lists imposed only a year or two thereafter and continue to be imposed to this day. And so that by making that separation and making clear that our campaigns for boycott, divestment, and sanctions are aligned with the Palestinian resistance and are aligned against imperialism, then we can help to avoid this process of threatening to create an alternative to the liberation movement and instead serve its actual intended function, which is being called for, which is to cut off the flow of weapons that take place between the imperialist powers. So I just wanted to thank both of you for your comments and elaborate, just add some thoughts on that ourselves through my organizing in Samidoun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network, which often contends with both of the issues of organizing for boycott campaigns, but also working to make clear that this is a campaign of providing support to the resistance through cutting off the flow of funds to the imperialists and the aggressors rather than the other way around. And I guess with that, I want to kind of lead into a question that we've received from at least 3 people who are attending today, which is asking, just going to read some of these questions because I think they represent a common sentiment from everyone here. So if the US does whatever it wants, how do we go about stopping their destructive path against the world? And then another question, what are the tangible actions that we could take in the imperial core to effectively oppose sanctions? We've already seen that legislators do not listen to the people, and it seems that the bulk of liberals, representative of the labor aristocracy, will always remain on the side of empire. And finally, what are the most significant ways that US citizens can organize against sanctions and other coercive economic measures? So there's a real demand to learn more about what people can do. Please, I would love to hear from any and all of you regarding what you see as mechanisms that people can get involved in. Obviously, the tribunal is meant to be one, and to help create one of those mechanisms. But I think all of you are so experienced in this that are likely to have various suggestions for people to engage with.
I'll just make one comment.
Yes, please go ahead, David.
I mean, just simply, first of all, we have to make people know that sanctions exist. These coercive measures exist because the media doesn't talk about it, and amplify the voices of, as I sort of remarked before, of the people suffering under these kind of measures, and because they're invisible, and we're talking about the U.S. population. They're invisible. What they're going through, what their viewpoints are invisible to the population here. And join groups who are trying to amplify those voices, learn more about the intricate ways that this financial coercion is affecting other countries, and there's numerous groups to work with. That just some comments.
Thank you so much. Would anyone else like to provide any further discussions of what you think people should be doing? Eunha, please go ahead.
I can add a couple of thoughts, Charlotte. I think none of them overly complicated, but I think, at the foundation, join an organization and make political education an essential part of that organization. I have friends in unions who say, you just need to join a union and they'll take care of it. And I'll say, is there no political education? Is there no rank and file, political education happening? And so I think to create the conditions for a broader movement, we need those two things, so that we can actually develop more education around how capitalism actually works. And I actually think a critique of liberalism is really essential also, and missing. And then thinking about, who are our revolutionary communities. Prison education, for example, is an incredibly important space for political education. In our organization, we just finished reading a Zach Cope book. The full title escapes me right now, but he and Torkel Lassen also did a nice article in the monthly review. But just understanding that 80% of the world's workers are in the global South, and 1 in 3 of them make less than $2 a day. And just the way that the working class is paid off in core nations, especially in the US, I think is really essential point to be made, and to build from, I think, so.
Can I maybe jump in just quickly? I think just agreeing with the previous responses to this question, and just to maybe build on those, I think something that I had mentioned in my talk is, the material basis of the ability to inflict sanctions, right, is monopoly capitalism, right? The fact, and this is the immensity of the task, right? And this is the immensity of the task that confronts anti-imperialism, even in the peripheries, right? Is on the one hand, there's a massive capital deficit, which then is how sanctions are deployed, because a state like Venezuela or other states actually need access to capital markets in the core to be able to undertake processes of industrial development, and actually to build industrial military capacity that provisions that material power with which you can actually confront US imperialism. So then the question for us then becomes, well, how do you actually on a structural material level confront US monopoly capitalism, right? When we think about what is the means through which sanctions are deployed, financial capital, the military industrial complex, let's say the different weapons companies, the different financial power exercised by the United States. But then this is a question that I saw some folks already mention in the Q&A. Well, how do you do this when legislation doesn't work? How do you oppose sanctions when the very forces in whose interest they're deployed are the executive committee behind the US Congress, right? How does one actually do that in a context of a labor aristocracy and all these things that we are familiar with, right? And so I think here, these are important questions of how do we start to mobilize against monopoly capital? And okay, can it happen within the US, or does it have to come from outside? Is it an international solidarity question of mobilizing, where from the periphery, the old questions around, is it the global South and anti-imperialism that will challenge capitalist imperialism, or is it labor movements in the core, or how do they speak to one another, right? And I think, when you see things like delegations going to Cuba, when you see the work that Nodutdol and other organizations are doing in building solidarity with peoples on the periphery under the impact of these sanctions, and then to think about how to mobilize some forms of counterpower to monopoly capital. I think that's really, that really has to be one element of analysis and action, right? Is how either concretely, right? Do you do things like Palestine Action is doing in Europe? Does that need to happen here in the United States in terms of confronting financial capital, military capital at the point of production? Or is it about building more delegations to Venezuela, to Cuba, and elsewhere, and trying to find a way to materially confront? I think that's the bind that we're in, right? Is that like, it's really an enormous task, the material basis of this power, right? How to challenge it and confront it.
I can just jump in too, just to say I agree with everything that's been said already as well. And just to add, this is a sort of age-old conundrum. Is the challenge going to come from the periphery and the global South, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist struggles, or from global North labor? And I think for sure it's not going to be, that's not to say that we shouldn't be organizing labor in the global North, but we should be taking the lead. And I think this is what the Tribunal is trying to do. And I think what most of us here are doing, what all of us I think are doing, is taking the lead of and standing in solidarity with these global South struggles. And the problem with labor, the labor aristocracy, as mentioned in one of the questions, is a real one, because as you were saying, Eunha, just joining a union isn't enough, because it's also about political education within the union and understanding the ways in which labor in the capitalist core have traditionally benefited from imperialism and from unequal exchange and the drain of surplus from the global South. And so, I want to just, I'd like to, as Charlotte was saying, we all have also different wear different hats here in the steering committee for the Tribunal, and I'm also involved in the international committee of my union, the PSC CUNY, and we, the international committee there has really done amazing work in both in the political education dimension in terms of helping CUNY academic workers to understand these unequal relations of power and how important it is for workers in the global north to stand against imperialism, because, there's this idea that, there are platitudes we can all say about, global, about standing in solidarity with global workers. But what does it really mean absent an anti-imperialist framework? Because imperialism and, sanctions as a key function of that, but also, as Bikrum and others were saying, the military industrial complex, finance, capital, and all of this, which works together, is undermining the ability of global South workers and peasants' popular struggles. So to really stand in solidarity with global South workers means to resist imperialism, but also to link it up to, I think, Eunha, which you were saying, which I agree completely, and that's also part of the framework of the tribunal, with struggles of oppressed communities in this country. And that means, within the context of the military industrial complex, the carceral state, the racist police state, in terms of indigenous struggles for land back and sovereignty. These are all connected struggles, ultimately with the same aim of defeating colonial capitalist imperialism. So making those connections is one way we get there. And and that's why I'm also super excited about this tribunal, because I think it's bringing together and it's really trying to make these connections and bring out the materiality of these relations. And I think, Bikrum, the point about reparations also is crucial, and that is one way to materially transform these relations. So yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Thank you so much, everybody, for a really comprehensive overview of what people can do to get involved, because staying silent and not acting is not an option, especially when there are so many people, organizations, and nations that are on the front lines struggling to live, to survive, but also to triumph and to go down a path of independent development, self-determination, and defeat of imperialism. I also want to invite everybody that if you're not yet part of an organization, if you're not part of one of the organizations that's endorsing or co-sponsoring the tribunal, to please get involved in these organizations that do provide political education, that are involved in anti-imperialist organizing and practice, and to become a part of these organizations that are already committed to this important process that's taking place, and to standing together in solidarity and in collective struggle with peoples and nations around the world fighting to defeat imperialism. We have one more question, and I think we'll take this question and then maybe ask all of our speakers for any closing comments. This question is, nations, from Spencer Williams, nations around the world seem to be in the process of de-dollarization. And what would the outcomes be? And this question asks about domestically, but I think we can also ask the question internationally once the dollar is no longer seen as a global reserve currency. And I know that both Corinna and Bikrum, you referred to this in your talks, but anyone is welcome to address this. Corinna, would you like to speak about this a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I'll just say something quick, and I'm sure the other panelists could speak to this as well, and probably with in a more informed way than myself. But I think that an important point to think about in terms of de-dollarization and the discussions that we've all been having in terms of how we resist sanctions and imperialism more generally, is that, again, it goes further than any sort of platitudes to supporting global South workers or supporting global South movements. in terms of decolonization, or their struggles to end unequal exchange and the exploitative conditions that the majority, as Eunha said earlier, of workers struggle under across the globe. De-dollarization would fundamentally destabilize US dominated capitalist imperialism. And in that sense, it really opens up the possibilities for the kind of decolonial, anti-capitalist, anti-oppressive and exploitative futures that we all are committed to. And so in that sense, I think it's a really crucial development, and one that we should all support for all kinds of reasons.
Maybe I would just quickly add, I think de-dollarization, if it actually took hold, and again, I don't want to be like the more pessimist amongst us, but I think, again, there still is I think the US dollar and US financial capital still has a really powerful hold. I think as we're seeing in what's happened in Zambia over the last few months, is they've demonstrated a real capacity to reverse and undo a lot of multipolar South-South advancements in economic exchange. We're seeing that happen in real time right now. But I think if de-dollarization was to actually take hold, you would see the US would lose a lot of its power to export inflation, right? To deal with its own the way it's able to stabilize class contradictions in the United States by exporting economic crises abroad would really hit a limitation, right? So like right now, you can increase interest rates. States in the periphery enter into economic crisis because they hold so much of their debt in US dollars when they're going on the Eurobond markets. So many transactions for core commodities are happening in US dollars. This throws them into economic crisis. It undermines their own domestic productive capacities. So you see a state like Zambia having to cancel so many actually productive like investments that would have raised their productive capacity to use their resources domestically, right? Which has the effect of freeing up resources for the core, again, to appropriate, right? Whether it's the minerals for the green transition or whatever it may be, the dollar enables that transfer from periphery to core. It enables the United States to consistently externalize its own kind of class contradictions and crises. So I think de-dollarization, and that's why, why there was such a threat, right? When Libya is talking about an African currency, right? Why that seems to be the line that U.S. Monopoly capital will not allow to be crossed. So I think that's a key question going forward. But I would also caution that the U.S. dollar is actually still very very strong and hegemonic, even in light of all of the really important and exciting challenges being waged against it.
Thank you so much. And thanks once again to all of our speakers for being with us today. Thanks to all of our attendees for being with us today, particularly on a Sunday morning or afternoon. We will make the recording available. We will be uploading it to the CASI YouTube page and sharing it. We will send an email to everyone with the recording as well. Are there any final thoughts that our speakers would like to leave us with? David, yes, please go ahead.
If everyone's going to say something, I'll just say a little something. I think it's really took to heart, and think it's important to remember in terms of the inevitable question of what is to be done is political education in terms of our role of people here in the global north, and to show how the same the system that's maintaining inequality around the world is the same system that's oppressing communities here and keeping us from enjoying a fuller and complete life that everyone deserves. And I had conversations in Cuba recently, and a number of the Cubans feel that the blockade may never end because it's so tied with domestic politics in this country, but they're not waiting for the US Congress. They are unifying, strengthening their alliances, being more creative to survive. And while they're doing that, we need to support them and learn from them, but educate our population about what sanctions are, what capitalism is, as was mentioned, and how we need to make our, change the system. It reminds me of this quote, and it's maybe not totally relevant, but Italian communists were asking Ho Chi Minh shortly before he died, what can we do to support your revolution? And he said, go home and make your own revolution. And I think we all have to keep that in mind, support the resistance in the global South, and work at home to educate people, because it really is a media war in so many ways. People are just bombarded by such propaganda. So that's all, some thoughts.
Thank you so much, David, and thanks again to everybody for being here today. Just in closing, once again, I want to remind everybody to please visit the website of the Tribunal. And if you can, if you're able to contribute, if you're able to participate in the fundraising campaign to support the Tribunal, this is a really important way of helping it to sustain itself. Of course, a project like this is not going to find sponsorship and support from large foundations that are part and parcel of the imperialist system. So we need support, grassroots support that comes from communities, that comes from people, especially movements within the imperialist core, to bring down these kinds of sanctions regimes and regimes of imperial domination. So please, if you or your organization or your movement are able to contribute and support, please go to our campaign and make a donation today. Today, Palestinian French lawyer Salah Hamouri was forcibly deported from his homeland, forcibly deported back to France after being born and raised in Jerusalem. And when he was returned to French soil against his will, he said, our motto must be resistance, liberation, return. And he also said specifically that he took an example from the Vietnamese people who showed it was possible to defeat US imperialism. And that so in much the same way, it is possible for the Palestinian people to defeat Zionism and to defeat the imperialist forces that support that Zionist regime. And in much the same way, when we look at the people in Iran committed to education and building their industries and building their economy despite everything against it, when we look at people in Lebanon who continue to fight back and resist, and who won the liberation of the south of Lebanon and continue to fight despite massive sanctions and economic devastation being imposed on the country, when we look at people in Zimbabwe who continue on a process of actual self-determination and reclamation of the land, when we look at people in Korea continuing to struggle for reunification, when we look at Palestine, despite over 50 years of sanctions and almost 75 years at this point, when we look at Palestinians in Gaza who continue to dig tunnels to fight and to resist and to fight back out occupied Palestine from the river to the sea, despite 75 years of colonization, of brutal domination, of siege, then when we look at people in Cuba who continue to export health to the world despite imperialist domination and murder being imported to their country, then we know that there is a real movement in this world that is fighting back. And we know that our responsibility is to do whatever we can to stand with that movement. And this tribunal is a small contribution. It's a beginning of a contribution, but it's a contribution to those movements, to that resistance, to that power, to that self-determination, and to the conviction that we do know that imperialism can be defeated and that the people can win, even though a long, hard struggle is necessary in order to make it so. Thank you once again to all of our speakers. We hope to see you all at the opening of the International People's Tribunal on US imperialism, blockade, sanctions, and coercive economic measures.